Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava,
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
and this is The Migration Story.
They feel that if another pandemic strikes, they will have to go through the same process. They have no other. 2004 to 2012, the trend was that the workforce engaged in agriculture was reducing, and that's a good sign of any economy. Now, what has happened is the workforce in agriculture has gone up by 40%.
This 25th March will mark 5 years since India imposed a nationwide lockdown to control the spread of the deadly COVID 19 pandemic. The nationwide lockdown, which lasted 68 days and was followed by several smaller lockdowns imposed by different state governments. More than 1 crore migrant workers returned to their home states. With public transport services interrupted, lakhs of migrant workers and their families undertook on foot journeys of hundreds of kilometers, facing death, despair, and starvation en route. Migrant workers, who bore the stigma of being disease carriers, were immediately hit with the loss of livelihood, food shortage, and economic distress. Most workers remained jobless for months, and their remittance dependent families faced penury and debt. Hello, my name is Anuja, and I am an independent journalist based in New Delhi. Apart from politics, elections, and policy, I report and write keenly on issues of migration, labor, gender, and on India's unorganized workforce. I began doing ground reports on migration exactly 4 years ago in March 2021 when I wanted to take a look at what has happened in years since the COVID 19 pandemic and its impact on migrant workers. It was around this time that I first interacted with Pushpendra, or Professor Pushpendra as most of us call him. Pushpendra is a former professor and chairperson of the Patna Center of Tata Institute of Social Sciences. He is a sociologist by training and has served as a visiting fellow at the Asia Research Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the past. Publications by him include a book titled Home, Belonging and Memory, Leaving and Living, and another one called Migrants on the Move, Precarity in the Times of the Pandemic. He is also the former editor of a biannual peer reviewed online journal called Journal of Migration Affairs, which had extensive contributions from migration experts across the country. Welcome to the Migration Story podcast, Professor Pushpendra. I am so glad you could make time for this conversation.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, Professor, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when we talk about the nationwide lockdown for migrant workers and the impact that it had on migrant workers?
The most enduring image of migrants that time was their defying the lockdown, and they're walking on the roads in lakhs and lakhs in number. The lockdown triggered a massive exodus of particularly interstate migrants, but also intrastate migrants. And they moved from the industrial growth centers for next 8 weeks or so. And that created the optics of their desperate attempts to return to their native places.
I understand, sir. You were at that time working closely with some of the communities in Bihar. You were also, from what I remember, spearheading a report on the issue. So, in your opinion, 5 years down the line, what are two or three the most lasting impacts of the pandemic and the lockdown?
We don't have data to say that with a very a definite sense that these are the lasting impacts, but some indications which we have and which we can extrapolate to attribute to the lockdown or to the pandemic. First is the increase in agricultural workforce. From pre-pandemic period, you get the data of 200 million people who are engaged in agricultural work. Now, 5 years after the pandemic, the data shows that there is an increase of 40% workforce in agriculture. So from 200 millions to now 280 million. That means 28 crores. From 20 crores to 28 crores people are now engaged in agriculture. Before the pandemic, particularly since 2004 to 2012, the trend was that the workforce engaged in agriculture was reducing, and that's a good sign of any economy. Because in agriculture, the rate of return is quite low in terms of wages or in terms of their earning. So when you have more diversification in the economy and particularly farm employment in rural areas or industrial growth centers, if you have more employment, then the income, average income of workers that go up. All developed economies have a very minuscule part of the workforce engaged in agriculture. Now, what has happened is the workforce in agriculture has gone up by 40%. So that's one lasting impact. I am willing to consider that this is result of a combination of various factors, not just pandemic. Perhaps also there is contribution by the GST and also demonetization process. Definitely, lockdown and pandemic, they contributed in that. I can say there are other factors also. For example, the lasting impact which I see is the fear factor of living in urban areas. That is still there, even if those who have gone back, who are working in urban areas. But when you ask them whether they remember pandemic, how they want to remember it, what happened during that period, whether it has any impact on them, during our surveys, we found that they feel that if another pandemic strikes, they will have to go through the same process. They have no other alternative. So they have to come back to urban areas to work in urban areas or even in rural areas in other states or in other districts. But this fear factor remains with them.
There are 120 million migrant workers in India, many of whom are daily wage earners.
This interview is part of our A Pandemic's Epilogue series that captures the present realities of hundreds of migrants who lost jobs and walked home during the first lockdown.
From a migration lens, how prepared do you think we are as a country if a pandemic of COVID level was to strike again? What happens then to the workforce that's on the ground, that's out on the roads in the cities? How prepared are we, do you think?
For that, we have to consider the factors which caused the kind of exodus of migrants we saw after the lockdown. So those factors are low income. That's most important thing. And then if you look at the other factors, which are generally called social determinants of marginalization, social determinants of health conditions, social determinants of low education, low skill. So if you look at all those social determinants, whether it's about kind of say the work they are engaged in, their saving rates, their access to food, or their access to decent accommodation at work site or in residential areas, their ability to pay rent, their living conditions, their working conditions, all these, the hygiene, their access to drinking water. If you look at these factors and also some other social factors, for example, the violence against them or discrimination or factors which cause anxiety, all these factors, if you look at them, they have by and large not changed. So if the income of an average person of 90% of India's population remains less than 6,000 rupees a month, that means the income has actually gone down for a vast majority, has stagnated. So their paying capacity for having a decent life in urban areas is extremely limited. So people continue to stay in the same condition in which that time social distancing was not possible. So I don't see the underlying causes of the migrants' exodus has changed in any respect.
That's a very great point, sir.
I would like to say that it's a business as usual. For example, during the COVID period, the government in September, I think that year, the government announced the remaining three labor codes, and those were passed by the government. And at the same time, also, at least in 10 states, they changed their labor laws and they extended the working hours to 12 hours. And in some of the states, they said that there is no need to pay overtime to workers if they are required to work overtime. There were several changes in the labor laws. And at the time when the organized protests to those changes in labor laws were not possible. So what has happened actually, the terms of engagement or the terms of employment for workers has actually worsened. It has not improved. Legal protections have been weakened. So you don't expect the conditions to change. The emphasis is on ease of business. The emphasis is on labor market reforms to make India attractive to FDI. So the entire focus is on liberalizing our labor markets, facilitating foreign direct investment, facilitating the capital actually to operate in free manner, and all these at the cost of workers' freedom, workers' protection, and workers' fundamental rights.
Millions of migrant workers keep our cities and our lives going. They serve as the backbone of several economic sectors and contribute to 10% of India's GDP.
The 10th standard, you should have like the max physics chemistry, you should have max physics migration, economics, commerce, migration. It should emerge as a new subject in the country.
Check out our website www.themigrationstory.com for more content.
The Migration Story.
There were a number of schemes, there were a number of initiatives that were announced around the issues of informal workers and migrant workers in particular, not just by the central government, but even several states. Asking you a slightly broad question on how do you see their implementation over the years? And are there any solutions that you think emerged out of the pandemic and are worth mentioning about?
We did a survey actually in 2022 April, and we did the survey both in Bihar, in 3 districts of Bihar, Supal, East Champaran, and Gaya, as well as in Mumbai. And what we found was that most of the workers, they didn't receive these benefit of the existing social insurance or whatever we call it, whether social security or social protection. When the workers came back, except Manrega, no other relief came to the workers, extra relief, I'm saying. Even in case of Manrega, we found that only 25% workers got some days of employment, though around 36% of them, they had demanded work. So I understand that that was the time of pandemic and local employment, getting workers at work one place and getting them work was also not that easy, and there was a fear factor amongst the workers. But nothing is specific. Most of these workers were landless workers, those who go out and work. So they didn't get any money under the Kisan Samman Nidhi Yojana, and only those who had some land. So in the routine process, they got some money from the government. And then that time we found that around 41% households or around 42%, they reported that they were suffering from extreme distress in the form of lack of work or the kind of expenditure they had to meet on illness, or almost 25% of them had new debt because of illness and their treatment. And the medical treatment cost amounted to more than 10% of their total expenditure at that time. This is the average figure. For some households, it was almost 25 to 30% of their expenditure. And during that period, the natural disasters in Bihar, for example, flood or drought, all those things also happened. So several families were in distress, and there is no specific scheme to help migrants except one, which is the One Nation, One Ration Card. Now, One Nation, One Ration Card is still, by and large, I can say it's a non-starter. And in any case, it has lost its focus. And when we did the survey, and we asked the workers in Mumbai whether they had any benefit from one nation, one ration card, and none of them, out of these 300 workers which we surveyed in Mumbai, none of them had taken any benefit under this scheme. So one can say that, see, the problem with our social security schemes is you have some relief in case of death or in case of disability. So there is a time inconsistency. So you take any of these social security schemes, for example, old age scheme, you invest today and you get the return after when you attain the age of 60. So before that, you don't get anything. And only in case of, say, non-contributory relief, for example, the widow pension or old age pension or disability pension, you are getting something at present. Under non-contributory benefits, you have the Food Security Act where you get subsidized ration. At present, people are getting free rations, more than 80 crores persons. And you also have other like midday meal scheme or ICDS. So non-contributory schemes are not for migrants. These are schemes which have their defined targeted group. It is not triggered at the time of disasters only or pandemics. It's for all time. When it comes to contributory schemes, they have this time inconsistency. So there is no specific, say, scheme which can help people in case of need in the real time, except for those who are registered under EPFO or ESIC, or those who require hospitalization and have Ayushman Bharat card. But then Ayushman Bharat card was not specifically for those suffering from pandemic related stress. So
Schemes like the affordable rental housing or the working capital loan that you get for street vendors, I mean, all of them in one way or the other was intended to help the migrant workforce.
see, these are the schemes which are general schemes. They're not specifically for migrants. That's first thing. They were not specifically meant to overcome the stress due to the pandemic. They would have helped. But see, the low cost, say, rental housing, you can't do it during the time of a pandemic. This has to be part of the long term housing policy, which is still lacking. So we don't have that kind of, say, low cost rental housing or low cost community housing or workers housing in our cities. And I don't see these things happening right now in any of the cities. You don't have those schemes where you have specifically, say, earmarked areas or earmarked buildings or new housing schemes coming up for migrants like community housings. It's not. In case of construction, some construction companies, they provide the housing at the work site, and that is for the duration of the work, and you know about the condition of these kind of these incentives which they provide to workers. So that policy is still lacking. There is no sign of any large scale community housing happening right now in the country. Now, the loan to vendors, for example, the Mudra loans to startups or different kinds of loans, these are the schemes which, in any case, are there and they require certain amount of social capital. First thing you have to understand that these are the schemes which are meant for self-employment. Okay. The vast majority of those who are self-employed, they are into micro activities. And 56% of our workforce is now under self-employment. And this number is, or the percentage has been increasing. But then the increase is also due to lack of opportunities for regular or salaried wage employment or casual employment. Actually, the decline is in daily casual employment. So those who are displaced from their daily casual work because of lack of work in the labor market, they are joining as helpers or they are joining as in various micro activities. So they are not in a
Right.
position to avail those loans. Okay.
Right.
So these are mostly been ineffective in case of workers or those workers who have been displaced due to lack of employment in labor market after the pandemic.
That brings us to the point that no policy or scheme can be effectively implemented in the absence of a hard data of its beneficiaries. And we all know there's an abject lack of numbers when it comes to migrant workers in India. How do you think lack of a robust data framework on the migrant workforce, especially the domestic migrant workforce, impacts policy planning and policy interventions?
Okay, so last survey specifically collecting data about migrants was conducted by NSSO in 2007 2008. So that's the last specific migration round of NSSO. So that means we are talking about some 17, 18 years old data now. The census, the last census was conducted in 2011. So again, there is gap of around 14 years now. So we don't have data. If you remember the act related to unorganized sector workers, which was enacted in 2008, that required the government to register all informal sector workers, including migrants, to give them a unique identification number, UIN, like your EPFO, where every worker who is registered under EPFO is provided unique number, which is called unique account number, UAN. Now, EPFO is for low earning workers in organized sector, small organized sectors. Okay. Because there is a provident fund, so they are registered. At least the registration is there. You know that how many people are there. You don't have much data about their current occupation, what they are doing, and how they are doing, but at least some registration is there. But then those who are employed in those units, which employs less than 10 workers, and the 56% of the total workforce of, say, around 48 crores or 50 crores, and 56% of them who are under self-employment, they are not enrolled under the EPFO. So that means we are talking about a vast majority of the workers who are not enrolled anywhere. And the government, which is so capable, so efficient to enroll people under Aadhaar, more than 110 crore people have been enrolled under Aadhaar, is unable to enroll people to respect its own act under this Unorganized Workers Act and give them unique identification number. So what we have at present is some kind of some projections, some vague idea. One vague idea is based on a specific chapter in the economic survey of 2016-17, which was particularly prepared by Arvind Subramaniam, who was that time heading the Economic Advisory Commission of the Prime Minister. And then some economists have worked on the data. And for example, Amitabh Kant wrote a long article after the first phase of pandemic, and he tried to estimate what was happening. And interestingly, he arrived at this data that around 1 crore 20 lakh people lost or were at risk of losing their employment. Perhaps most of them lost their employment, and these were the people who actually were willing to come back. And 25% of them were from UP and 14% from Bihar. So these two states alone contributed to something like 40% of those workforce who lost their employment. And they were in dire need of state support. So at present, we don't have that kind of data. So what's happening right now? Some of these states have been thinking about their own ways of enumerating their migrants. Recently, Bihar government has announced two things. One is that they want to register their migrants, and they have developed an app, and this is called Bihar Pravasi Kamgar app. But at present, their target is to register 20 lakh migrants and at the panchayat level. So they are just the target is of just 20 lakh migrants. It's not about all migrants, the target is given. What will happen to these registered migrants? Because we already have e-Shram portal, but we don't have access to the detailed data about this e-Shram portal, how it is being used, how many migrants, whether it's a dynamic data portal, whether this even the app will be dynamic, because a migrant today maybe say migrate from Bihar migrating to Punjab, the next time the person may migrate to Vijayawada or to Chennai or to Arunachal Pradesh, anywhere, whether we have the dynamic data, what is the system of updating, how the workers are supposed to be updated. So still a lot of questions remain. We have also announcements by the Bihar government. They have reiterated it. Actually, this was piloted, and they had already announced in the past also that they will have migration facilitation center at destination places, particularly in big cities. So they have reiterated it again in this year's budget. The center is supposed to facilitate the migrants in terms of any difficulty they face, and they face actually the wage theft, particularly wage delay, wage cutting, less or no payment. So at present, we don't have any reliable data and any dynamic data or any kind of unique identification number of all informal sector workers to track their condition, to support them.
Right. That's truly well said, sir. I'm sure our listeners have found all the observations and interesting insights that you have made very interesting. It has been a pleasure, sir, for having you here, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us and taking out the time to be with us.
Thanks. Thank you for having me here. Thank you very much, Anuja.
It's been our pleasure, sir. To all our listeners, please stay tuned to the coverage of Migration Story, particularly our current series, where we'll talk about the COVID-induced lockdown and tell stories of how it changed the lives of migrant workers and their families in myriad ways. Thank you for listening in.
Check out our website www.themigrationstory.com for more content. You can subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. The audio editing and sound design is by Akshay Ramuhalli. Stay tuned for more stories on migration.
Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava,
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
and this is The Migration Story.